Hi, I'm going to attempt to do something in this video where I'm going to talk about Deleuze and Guattari, if I'm even saying it right. I have an astrology channel, and I have been... Well, it doesn't really matter. The point is that I'm not going to be talking about astrology in this video. I figure I will attempt to talk about Deleuze and Guattari, and I'll preface this by saying that I'm not a philosophy student, and I am a person who has had experience with the mental health system, and was even considering about titling this video something like, Deleuze and Guattari for schizos or something like that, because there's a certain thing about approaching this from that position where the popular narrative, or the kind of people who get into Deleuze and Guattari, are probably more going to be like academic types or intellectuals, and probably not people who are themselves in the midst of psychosis, because if you've ever been there, you've probably got other things to worry about than trying to figure out how to read Deleuze and Guattari. I don't know. But I mean to say, I don't know. There's certain attitudes that I find that I see going around with in response to the capitalism and schizophrenia stuff, where there's always a reminder not to romanticize mental illness, and that... But the things what happens is that I find that usually the Deleuzians end up taking a pretty conservative, not really that radical view towards mental health stuff most of the time. And for me, I'm kind of like, I'm dealing more with physical health issues right now. And I'm also reading a book from Gabor Mate called The Myth of Normal, where I'm starting to realize that he does a good job of explaining how there's a kind of a disease process that plays out, and it's not really like there's a line, he uses a line from that, it's like going broke, where you start growing broke gradually and then suddenly, and then so that there can be a disease process that is in the background, and then maybe there's a crisis, and then you're really sick, and then you're better, but then it's still there and it comes back, and then it can play out in different ways and stuff like this as an underlying thing, right? So it's there's people get really hung up about this whole thing of like, am I really sick or not? And it's like, it can be a kind of a you go back and forth, and it can be a bit of a process, right? But I think that whole thing about Gabor Mate, there's certain things in that Gabor Mate book, The Myth of Normal, where he's talking about to understand disease as a process rather than just a thing that you have. Like, I have a disease, like I have a TV, like I have a stereo system, and that I am the possessor of this thing that does this thing that's harmful, and I need to get rid of it. That is rather a process that, especially with cancer, you can't isolate a specific entity, except for there's the byproducts, but rather it's more of like a traffic jam, right? Which is very Deleuzian. Like, the flow is not flowing, so there's a kind of a blockage of energy that builds up, and then a kind of a disease builds out of this kind of energy blockage, right? So in a way that I find that Deleuze and Guattari is great, because if you're going to understand what they're saying, you can read other stuff and then read it from a Deleuzian lens, and have it all work together. But Gabor Mate, of course, would talk about the effects of living in capitalism and all this on the psyche, and living in a very competitive, atomized, individualistic kind of, and that kind of psychology driving stress for disease. And it's a much more like easy way to understand things to just read Gabor Mate rather than trying to read Deleuze and Guattari, right? So the thing is, when I first was approached Deleuze and Guattari, I never even heard of them, and I was kind of like approaching the topic of, I was like, is this going to be like capitalism and schizophrenia as a more straightforward approach to the topic like that? But unfortunately, it's very, well, first of all, it was in French to begin with, and then it's translated, and the whole style is kind of wacky. But I before I ever got into this stuff, I would read Henry Miller, and I'd read William S. Burroughs and Jack Kerouac, and it's not like it's that unusual for me to get, and so there's something about this that kind of stoked my curiosity of like, how did I go so long without knowing about Deleuze and Guattari? And then I would run into the stuff about the way it's the language, the way they talk about machines, the way they talk about mechanization and the human as being mechanical, and I found that kind of unsettling. And then I could kind of get the desiring machine thing, but then when they went to started talking about body with organs, I was just like, what the hell? And you have these moments where you want to throw the book across the room, and then the people, how I got introduced to this stuff was like some kind of a book club that either it never got off the ground, or I just made an ass out of myself because I'm trying to talk to these random people. Because it was exciting, like, oh my god, there's people in the city in Vancouver who are into this cool intellectual stuff, and they're into schizophrenia, and then I'm just like a schizo who doesn't have no idea what's going on. Just like, what the hell what the hell are you people talking about with your bodies without organs, right? So it was kind of a point. I don't even know what the heck, who any of these people are really, but a main guy who introduced it to me gave me a desk in which I still use to have electronic music gear and speakers and stuff like that, a studio desk. And I've got some free stuff from this guy, as well as being turned on to Deleuze and Guattari. So whatever, it's all good, I guess, right? But what can I say? If I'm going to seriously talk about the body with organs, without organs, I should mention that it comes from... decided to get this book from Artaud, if I'm saying his name right. The guy who did The Theater of Cruelty is apparently the guy who coined the term. And here we can talk about what the body without organs means in the original context where it comes up, because that's when you do that, it makes it a lot more simple. And so I'll just read about like a page or two before it happens here. So, I don't know. I mean, Artaud, also to give a preface, is that, like, this is kind of like the late stage, and he'd been through all this traumatic stuff in psychiatry, and he's writing, but he's often quite profane and stuff, and I'm not going to put whatever. This is hopefully, I think this doesn't have too much bad stuff in it, but just as a heads up. Anyways, he says, and it's also translated from French, of course. I'm not mad. I'm telling you that microbes have been reinvented in order to impose a new idea of God. The way has been found to make God come out again and to catch him in the act of his microbial noxiousness. It's to nail him to the heart, there where men love him best, in the form of sickly sexuality, in that sinister guise of morbid cruelty which he dons in the hours when it pleases him, as it does now, to tendonize and madden humanity. He uses the spirit of purity and a consciousness that has remained ingenious like mine to asphyxiate it with all the false appearances which he spreads universally through the spaces, and it is thus that Artaud the Momo can appear to be hallucinating. What do you mean, Mr. Artaud? I mean, I have found the way to have done once and for all with this monkey. And if nobody believes any more in God, everybody believes more and more in man. And it is man that must now decide to emasculate. That is man that we must now decide to emasculate. How so? How so? From whatever angle one approaches you, you are mad enough to tie down. By having him undergo once more, but for the last time, an autopsy in order to remake his anatomy. I say in order to remake his anatomy. Man is sick because he is badly constructed. We must decide to strip him in order to scratch out his animalcule which makes him itch to death. God, and with God his organs. For tie me down if you want to, but there is nothing more useless than an organ. When you have given him a body without organs, then you must have delivered him from all his automatisms and restored him to his true liberty. Then you will teach him again to dance inside out, as in the delirium of dance halls, and that inside out will be his true side out. So I'd like to transition from that reading of Artaud, Antonin Artaud, to a sort of anecdote about what it's like being in the psych system. And fortunately, at least I can say it's been over 10 years. This is actually going to be like around the time of my 11-year anniversary of the last time I was ever hospitalized in a psych ward for anything to do with mental health. So at least I have the sense of it being in the rear view, right? But in that period of time, I, being a kind of person who likes to read books, at one point in time, I decided to reread Philip K. Dick's Valis in the psych ward, and I had this sort of like, kind of was possessed by this kind of idea that maybe there was some kind of like mystical truth or some sort of revelation, and I was really excited about the idea of the Sophia. And there's certain things going on in my own states that kind of was relevant to that, and also not wanting the psych system to be medicating my whatever spiritual experience away. And then, unfortunately, I mean, when I was kind of in and out of I didn't take my meds though. I got out of the psych ward and I refused to take my meds, and I just ended up in the psych ward not like, a couple weeks later, and they forced me onto a one of those court order, you have to go in and get ejected with antipsychotics and stuff like this. And then there's this other book that I was reading during that time where I was kind of like depressed before I wound up in that psych ward or whatever, and it was Haruki Murakami's IQ 84, and it's a fairly long Haruki Murakami book, and there is there's certain things that may be relevant to the body without organs in that book. Specifically, there's the lunar archetype, and that book talks about a second moon that appears in the sky that only the protagonist can see. And there's something about the moon as a kind of like an egg as a theme that I might revisit later. But aside from subtle things like that, there's something of the point of the IQ 84 was more that I had read a bunch of other, like the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle and Kafka on the Shore and the Wild Sheep Chase and Norwegian Wood. I'd read a bunch of Murakami books leading up to the point of going psychotic, and I was just reading the latest Murakami book that came out, but it was interesting to read that in the psych ward because I was not really investing that much into this book, but in the social circumstance of reading a large hardcover book in a psych ward, I would get like other patients kind of making jokes like, "Oh, are you gonna figure it all out by reading that book? Is that have all the answers in it, man?" Oh, and then so it's kind of like, as soon as you're in, it's not a neutral. What I'm trying to say is it's not a neutral situation to be in a psychiatric situation where there's something where you could just be reading a book kind of neutrally because it's an author you like, and then people could be reading into that as if you're like, obsessed with the plot line of this book, or that it's feeding some fantasy. It's like people just build their own idea of whatever it is that you've got going on that may not actually have anything to do with where you're at. And that it was kind of frustrating a lot of the time because I kind of felt like it was kind of wandering through other people's projections or perceptions of me and not being able to really like see clearly what it is specifically that's going on. But one of the things that was kind of frustrating about this was that there's one of the things is, I've talked about this before, is that as soon as you get in there, people start kind of interrogating you like a criminal, and like, how much drugs do you do? Have you ever stolen things? Are you involved in crime? And it's like, it's more of like a kind of a, it could easily just be treated by the police system rather than the health. There's kind of like this overlap. Like if you draw a Venn diagram of the healthcare system and the criminal system, and you put psychiatry, it kind of overlaps. And so you start to get this thing where you start feeling like you're not dealing with healthcare professionals. It feels like you're dealing with police, which is kind of, or that some ambiguous blending of the two, right? And which is something like the problem about that is that the idea of whether or not treatments are used to help a person recover, or if treatments are used as a kind of a punishment or something like that, right? I've talked about all this before. The other thing though is it could also just be that a lot of the people, especially, Vancouver, the downtown east side, Surrey, and, the addiction and crime, that it's just statistically that maybe a lot of people that have addiction problems or a lot of people that have mental health problems are also caught up in some criminal behavior, or maybe it could just go with the territory, right? Which could be understandable. So maybe that's all it is that just that based on the bell curve of what's normal, right? Of if you're dealing with people, you have to ask these questions and just kind of go in neutrally. But there's what I also noticed, the preconceived kind of perceptions is that people often treat you kind of like you're an idiot, basically, right? But the thing is, what I realized more recently, I've started reading The Idiot, which is like, not to say just being stupid, but there's this whole thing about being kind of like a holy fool. That's a kind of like an archetype where like the village idiot was actually like, rather than the village idiot just being like the jester or the clown or something like that, there's also this kind of the thing of the mystic, right? Or the drunken master or something like that, is that the mystic is in some way kind of like a village idiot, or that there's some way where the village idiot crosses over into, or the village fool crosses over into mystical territory as a kind of archetypal dynamic that's kind of like if you get into the tarot and all this kind of stuff, it's like kind of a big archetype that precedes any, individual, whether you're an idiot or not, right? And so, there's some, and the Dostoyevsky's The Idiot, I've only, it's 600 pages, and I just started reading it. It's going to take me a while for this one probably, but there's the idiot has the falling sickness, like a kind of epilepsy, right? And for me, this was really interesting because during the time where I was hospitalized, I had a coworker with epilepsy, and there was some kind of weird, like, parallel I felt where I was working with somebody who had a different disability, but I was kind of like, I didn't know much about epilepsy, and it's like, is there some way that this person could sympathize with what I was going through? I don't even know how to approach that topic because what I was going through was so taboo. Right? So, but maybe that person could have been more understanding than what I have realized, right? And then that's just like a little detail, anyways, right? But she, as an epileptic, did not seem like she had much of a body without organs. You know what I mean? Like the body without organs isn't just having epilepsy. She wasn't a village idiot, and I didn't feel like either was I really, right? The person who had a job, and whatever. But okay, I don't want to also be mean and condescending or whatever, but I have to admit that like there is that quality of idiocy though, and that at some point in time it comes up. I could also describe it as being a kind of a naivete, a kind of innocence that like a lot of the time when people have, I've noticed too, if you meet somebody who's had brain injuries, or traumatic head injuries, if it's just like physical trauma or something like that, or like a concussion, that oftentimes there are people whose personality changes and they kind of become a bit more innocent and childlike, or also the people would say that there's a sort of adult filtering mechanism that's not there anymore, and they'll just be like, express what they want to, and they're kind of just more, but there's something about that actually goes with pathology of brain damage or something, but it could, I don't know, there could also be something that comes out of, there's a spiritual component that's not just biological pathology, I find, because there's a sort of a preliminary kind of innocence, and that people often talk about even people that are disabled, right? The disabled people being very pure and innocent and stuff like this, right? But the problem, if you let's go back to what Artaud was saying, is that it's almost like if you get into this stuff that so much mental illness has to do with trauma, specifically he's kind of talking about sexual trauma and stuff like that, and the shame and the whole thing about, when we're talking about innocence, the one thing that innocence seems to go with is a desexualization, or like a childlike, to restore the child, especially, childhood is better to have, not be exposed to childhood sexual trauma, obviously. It's better, so to restore childhood to its original innocence and whatnot, and to seek, when you're going through mental health stuff, there's often sort of like changes in the personality, and one of the things I remember is my family members saying, they wish they could just get the old Dan back, that whoever this is, they don't recognize him and they want the old Dan back or whatever, right? But the whole thing, so this is a good way to get to the body without organs, because it's the body without organs is essentially saying that whatever's developed, whatever's at some point in time, one of the organs that makes up this person and who they are have become unacceptable, so we need to sort of like empty them out and then restore them to a kind of naive, childlike, innocent state, and then build them back up again into who we think they should be, right? And there's a certain conversation about how much of a person is really... There's this whole MK Ultra kind of thing, right, too, about like where they tried to like give people lots of acid, or like if you go into psychiatry, this horrific stuff about lobotomization and stuff like this. But the idea of curing mental illness by removing the proverbial organ that's making the problem and restoring them to a kind of a naive, innocent, childlike state in which you can imprint a new program onto them, basically. But it's kind of a violent thing to do in a way, because it doesn't really respect the person's own, what they want, or how they, you could say, we want the old Dan back, but you don't ask the Dan that's there what he wants. And so in a sense, it's essentially kind of doing violence to the personality that's presenting itself by saying it's not an honest or authentic personality, and that it needs to be removed and destroyed in place of an original innocence that it basically also isn't affected by problems if you bring in the Artaud stuff about sex of a sexual nature, that the person is restored to a kind of an childlike innocence, desexualized thing. And the whole problem about sex, though, is that if you don't do that, right? If you just play it out, it would be easy for me to talk about certain friends of mine, right? But I'll try to make it more generic than that and not talk about personal situations with people, because people tend to be offended when I do that. But if you kind of look at the situation of like being a human being with desires, with needs, and all this kind of stuff, then it turns into this whole kind of thing. Like, my mom was really into the stuff about choice theory, right? Like, there's this guy, William Glasser, who talked all about driving a car where you look at what your goals and desires are, and are you meeting those desires, and what do you do to change those kinds of things. And so the problem with that, from the Deleuze and Guattari perspective, is that it's kind of like, so let's, like, your basic, most fundamental desires could be for love and belonging and whatever, right? A meaningful life and all this kind of stuff. And so, but in our consumeristic society, we're kind of manipulated by images of sex and, pop music and romance and all this kind of stuff. And so we're kind of conditioned to view the gratification of those desires in a specific way, and then we're also conditioned with certain messages of what we need to be in order to satisfy those desires. And so and then we get into what Deleuze and Guattari talk about, codes, right? Where they talk about how when you wear different clothing, like a way a woman is dressed, and there's all this stuff about like if you're dressing your age, if you're looking too sexy or not, and the way that men police the way women dress is to the way and the whole thing about women being like, I'll wear whatever I want, right? You know, like I don't need men to tell me what I want. I'll be free and be liberated and all this stuff. This came out of the 60s, right, when all this stuff was happening. So that's a important part of the conversation. The whole thing about the code to enforce that this certain, if you can't wear too much, show too much skin, because then to the male gaze that looks slutty and you're just asking for it for sexual abuse or something. There's a system of coding which is in place, which is to make the argument, if you listen to the way people talk about this, that men shouldn't go around sexualizing women, that if you're showing skin, it's actually pretty neutral, and it's more reflects the attitude of somebody who makes that into a signal for desire or something when it doesn't have to be, but it comes out of this whole system of coding, of associations, of associating this with that, of associating things with cues for pleasure, or also of associating to be like, what kind of codes do I have to display if I'm doing a mating dance or whatever? Like, what do I have to show in order to attract the mate that I want? And we've got the media culture that we live in basically has created this thing where people that are like social media influencers try to make businesses just capitalizing on this toxic masculinity of like insecure men who feel like they're not good enough, and what do I have to do to display the right codes, to display the right signals, to make myself, at some point in time, it may not even be about whether or not they can attract a mate or not, or to have sex, because it could also just essentially be about their own self-esteem and their own self-image, and how to deal with a system that's conditioned them to think this way, and just playing out that conditioning, right? And the whole thing about, the thing about what I'm trying to say about the body without organs, if you have this whole desire, as soon as we get into this William Glasser stuff about making choices and all this, we run into a heavily conditioned society where I have to jump through all these different hoops, and I have to fulfill all these expectations, and I have to live my life to achieve a certain image, to get what I want, and all this kind of stuff. And like, it seems you're under all these demands and pressures. Okay, maybe some of them people find them not impossible, but that's the situation. What therapy in my mind gets turned into is basically, so you understand, obviously it's clear what you have your desire, and you have what you understand about all the conditioning that you have to put yourself through to make that desire. So what do you do except for just do it? Do what you have to do. Make yourself into then therapy, as in a sense, is in a way where a person has no fundamental authentic self. I have talked to people online about this, about whether there's an authentic self or not. A lot of people believe there isn't one, and the implication that there is no authentic self is that anything that makes your personality what it is essentially something that can be changed. And you have to go through this process of essentially the body without organs, about emptying yourself out, basically annihilating everything about yourself and becoming essentially a smoothed out, innocent, naive, that makes the whole, we're all one and it's all one love. And then from that position, look at the capitalistic society and all the conditioning and subjugate yourself to be a perfect capitalist producer, and then you can achieve all the desires you want. That's the sick and twisted, but that's not what what we don't want to do here. The thing about the body without organs, though, is that if you go into the process of deconditioning, you may stumble upon something where you realize that it may actually be a lot easier to get a sense of satisfaction from removing some of these organs, as you would say, and not reinstating yourself to a system of more trauma that inflicts you with this conditioning, saying that it's not okay to be this way, that you have to be a certain way, that love is conditional, that love is there as a carrot on the end of the hook that we're going to dangle in front of you to jump through endless amounts of hoops, and then you can reward yourself for being a good worker, but you never feel satisfied. The body without organs at some point realizes that The problem, though, is that some people have to jump through these hoops and do all these things just to survive. You know what I mean? And it's not about whether or not you're trying to realize your desires, realize your ambitions, live the life you want to live. It's like you just have to survive, right? And that's when you get into this whole conversation about identity politics and privilege, and I'm a white guy and whatever. And then I could, lean on the fact that I got a diagnosis and stuff like that to somehow, play whatever. I don't really feel like doing that though. I might as well just be a disabled, privileged person. I don't know. Maybe that cancels each other out. But anyways, but on that note about the problem of privilege, I got to this point in Deleuze and Guattari, Anti-Oedipus. The chapter is called The Molecular Unconscious, and this is in the part that's on schizoanalysis. And it's already been half an hour, I might as well wrap it up. So I'm going to just read this part, because I felt this part of the book, there's so much of this book, I have to also explain for anyone trying to read Deleuze and Guattari that it's not a very even... some parts are really written differently than other parts, and there's some parts that are easy to understand, and there's some parts that are completely that are just like, what are they trying to do to me with this book? But what I realize is they tend to put the easier stuff at the end, and I think that they're most of the book essentially is to scare people off, so that only the good people get this stuff, right? Hopefully I'm not letting the cat out of the bag and spoiling it and ruining it for everybody by telling you what the body without organs is, but here, or at least how I understand it. I'm going to read a bit from, what is this, page 284. A profound text by Samuel Butler, The Book of the Machines, nevertheless allows us to go beyond these points of view. It is true that this text seems to, at first, merely to contrast the two common arguments, the one according to which the organisms are for the moment only more perfect machines, whether those things which we deem most purely spiritual are anything but disturbances of equilibrium in an infinite series of levers, beginning with those levers that are too small for microscopic detection. So I'm just going to make a note here and say, one of my issues with Deleuze is that Deleuze tends to take an attitude that is very materialistic, and I think to some extent, I think Deleuze was maybe the trends of academia and what you have to adopt. But I mean, what he's trying to do though is that there's a certain trend in philosophy that they don't like transcendentalism, right? And by reducing it all down to like what we call spiritual could just be subtle physicality to the point so subtle that we can't see it, and we can't see it. It's this magical thing that's ineffable or whatever. But there's still a physical thing we just can't. It's too subtle for us, right? And there's a scientific tendency to be like, physics, quantum physics, and all this stuff, that maybe it's all just materially explainable, and we don't need to have transcendent, we don't need metaphysics. And the way I'm approaching Deleuze, anyways, that's kind of how I read him, and I like him up to a point, but I like to go transcendental with it. So that's just saying that I'm a bit different. I don't know. But anyways, the other, according to which machines are never more than extensions of the organism. The lower animals keep all their limbs at home in their bodies, but many of man's are loose and lie about detached, now here and now there in various parts of the world. So, this as somebody with autoimmune condition that I'm working on, this is something that I'm particularly interested in, this part, because there's this issue. I've also, for somebody talking about this, check out Sophie Strand, a young woman with some health issues that she writes really interesting stuff about this kind a kind of a postmodern ecological Gnostic kind of thing. Like Sophie Strand's pretty cool, but this whole thing about cybernetics in terms of disability and the idea of the immune system. I was talking on the group Shades of Awakening about exploring the possible connections between bipolar and schizo whatever with immune stuff, and that maybe certain, you know, the brain on fire could just be inflammation and all this. And but there's also Gabor Mate talks about the social situations and whatnot, and it's difficult to unpack it as just being a single cause. And that, I think, like Gabor Mate's book does a good job because he talks about how it can be a lot of different causes adding up or whatever, and it's not just a single cause of like this specific problem having an issue or whatever. But there was a comment though, anyways, of this woman who was kind of talking about it in terms of the boundaries, right? Of like your skin or your boundaries or whatever is inflamed, or the idea of your separation or being. The Gabor Mate in his book talks a lot about living your life for other people, right? Living your life for the needs of other people. But essentially though, you're talking about things like codependent relationships and all this, but if you look at what I was trying to say in my astrology channel when I was ranting against capitalism, is that, you know, in some way capitalism is like this, in that it's like a relationship with somebody who grants you all this stuff, but then you are hooked into a system of debt where what you're doing every day, what rules your life and what you do is kind of, it doesn't seem like it's like I'm independent because I don't have a person that I'm dependent on, but I'm dependent on this abstract system which puts all these demands and pressures on me, and somehow being dependent to that is okay, but being dependent on your family or being dependent on people in relationships is bad. It's bad to have relationship dependency, but it's good to go into debt and be an independent bachelor that's running up all these bills or something, right? But one of the things that I like with Deleuze Guattari is they talk about basically the Anti-Oedipus is that the whole process of therapy being like desire, like sexual desire means man and a wife making babies. So that if that's what you want, if you take the William Glasser position to like, if you like, I have to make myself into a good partner as a husband. Like if I have sexual desire, it means that I need to make myself into a good husband and reproduce and have kids and all this kind of stuff, and submit myself to the code of what makes a good husband and live my life from that, because that's what the apparatus, the coding machine does, right? But Deleuze what they're trying to say is that you can use that motivation to do something different, to say, you know, have a, you know, that people are, let's say, I don't know if I agree with polyamorous relationships, but it's an easy example of that the libidinal energy could take a different formation. Or else you could say, instead of living with a wife, maybe I'm going to get a bunch of buddies that and we can have platonic friends living together as housemates, and that we don't and somehow make that work, rather than having this pressure that we all have to become, you know, men and having kids and fitting this really narrow view of, because essentially what happens is that the idea is that you have a certain, if you look at Game of Thrones, right, if you have the like the Targaryens and the Valerians and stuff, it's not just to have a man and woman having a cute little cottage and you know, little Joe and Susie, the babies or whatever. It's like you have a whole bunch of people that are benefiting from a power structure of putting their, you know, what you call dependencies, right? Let's put all our dependencies together and create a army, create an empire, create a, you know, and in capitalism, by making it all, we have to be independent. You have to be, you know, we're just gonna have everybody independent, wife and kids in their own little bungalows. It makes it really easy for people to be controlled, right? Because you don't have any power at all if you do it like that. Especially when you have all the demand. Like, not only do you have to work my job, but I have to clean. You know, the wife's nagging on me because I do all these chores around. You don't have any political power at all because you're completely pussy whipped, basically, right? And that's kind of what Deleuze and Guattari is getting at with the Anti-Oedipus, is that do you really want to carry out that libidinal investment to its end, because that's what it ends up with. You know, people working themselves to death to fulfill frustrating family situations that aren't really satisfying. It doesn't sound like it's really that good of an idea to me, anyways. So anyways, I'm getting distracted here. There's a Butlerian manner for carrying each of the arguments to an extreme point, where it can no longer be opposed to the other, a point of non-difference or dispersion. For one thing, Butler is not content to say that machines extend the organism, but asserts that they are really limbs and organs lying on the body of organs of a society, which men will appropriate according to their power and their wealth, and whose poverty deprives them as if they were mutilated organisms. So essentially, the whole thing about, like, you have to get a job and a family and have kids and be a good, diligent dad, and the whole pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction, you have to sacrifice that to be a responsible parent and do all this stuff, is essentially, it's like, I mean, you could do that if you want to, but there are a lot of other options, different directions to go in, that our society invests a lot in limiting, so that you can only look at what you have to do with your life in this very limited, myopic, you don't have any options at all. All you have to do is get in line and try to compete with the rest of those bozos for some wife who's gonna hate you in a few years. It's like, what a lame. Why would anybody want to sign up for that? And so, if you can divest yourself of that, then you have the opportunity to create a body without organs, where your interactions with society you can start constructing them more intentionally, but there is a vested interest not to get people to do this, because people start to realize a lot of what what makes society go, what makes the world tick, could, like Adyashanti would say, is that, like, if a lot of people woke up, a lot of the capitalist machine might just stop running, because they might just say, like, why? So I have to do all this stuff what am I supposed to? Why? As a kid, which was the body without organs, right? Like, a little naive kid would just say, why? Why do I have to go to work? Why do I have to be a dad? Why do I have to have kids? Why can't I smoke weed? Why can't I drink beer? Why can't I go to the rave party? Why can't I go dancing? Why can't I have fun? Why do I have to be depressed? Why do I have to be anxious? Why do I have to feel like people hate me? Why do I have to hate myself? Why? Just fuck all that. I just rebel against it. And so that's, exactly. So that, hopefully my, and that's the schizo analysis of the situation. Okay, and this is my video on the body without organs. Thank you very much.